Good morning, all. So, myself Chandra, and in today's session, we are going to discuss about Mulesoft scopes. So, basically, scope means it defines a limit or boundary, and within Mulesoft, we have message processors to build up flows. And these message processors, whatever the activity that we are going to perform, it is limited to that particular flow. And the group or chain of message processors we are going to group, and we are performing a task. And below are the scopes available within Mulesoft. We are going to discuss one by one. The flows, subflow, and private flow. This by default run in synchronous mode whenever we call it using the flow reference. For example, if we have a loggers and we have multiple message processors within the flow, each message process will be executed once the previous message process is completed successfully. So to understand this, I'm going to make a change in the suppliers API flow. I have removed the set payload and here add a flow reference component and refer the router state asset supplier subflow. And within this subflow, I have added two loggers. One is subflow started and another one subflow completed. Let us deploy and check the response and also observe the logs. Application is deployed, clear the console and test it from Postman. I'm sending a request. Yeah, now I have received a response. So we have sent a request to the suppliers flow. And within the suppliers flow, we have loggers and flow reference and also transfer message. So each of these components are going to execute one by one, and it will wait for the response of the previous component or previous message processor. And here, if we observe the console, we have the loggers and each logger is executed and printed on the console one after the other, which means it is executing the message process in sequence manner in flow. So by default, flows or subflows are executed in sequence manner or synchronously. We even call it as synchronous. For example, if we see here, every message processor is printing one after the other. And let us try to observe the asynchronous one. So when we say asynchronous mode, so asynchronous scope will execute the thread separately or independently, and the components defined within the asynchronous scope will be in synchronous mode. I mean, so there is a asynchronous scope component and the message process that are defined within that particular asynchronous scope will be again executed synchronous. Let us understand that. So this list of suppliers information, we have supplier number and supplier name. And the same information we need to send to the other system, or we want to send this information via email to group of employees so that they can use these suppliers and create the invoices or create the purchase orders. So for that, we want to notify them. But this process is not synchronous. I mean, we don't need to wait for the response, like whether that mail has been sent or not, or we are not worried whether that mail was sent successfully or if it is failed. So in that case, we can define a asynchronous scope, and within that asynchronous scope, we can add the message processors, group of message processors or chain of message processors, and we can perform that activity. For example, I'm going to add a logger and before that add a asynchronous scope. So within asynchronous scope, I'm going to add logger, logger in async, and payload. So for that, I'm going to use a transform message and I want to group the supplier name and supplier number. So for example, this is our supplier number and supplier name. I want to use supplier number and supplier name. So payload dot supplier number join by com. So all the supplier numbers information will be comma separated. And I want to send this information like we have received so and so suppliers. New suppliers. Supplier name. And this also I am going to join by. And in between, I am going to use concatenation with hyphen. So this is our message. We are having a welcome message. We have new suppliers, supplier number and supplier name. Like this, we wanted to send the information. Let us assume that these are the new supplier. And we have added one message process and logger. And also here, the third component will be like, there will be a target system or a file system where we want to write the data. It can be a mail. Mail to send a mail, there will be SMTP. So you can use email send. But for this, we need to configure the IP addresses and also we need to configure where to send the information. So right now I'm not doing that. I'm just showing the. So here we have to provide the information, host IP address and the username and password from which login account you want to send the information. So all this kind of information you have to configure and you can mention that to whom you have to send the mail like a CC, BCC and also to which address you want to send this information. I'm removing it. I'm just going to log that information in asynchronous scope. Save the changes. Let us test the service. So we are still receiving the response, which is supplier number and supplier name in JSON format. But there is a transform message after this particular transform message. Even though we are producing the supplier number and supplier name, but after that we have one more transform message, which is producing a string format of response. But yet we are receiving the JSON response in our service. And I am going to check the logs. If we check here, all the message processors are the components in the loggers are executed one after the other in sequential manner, which are not in the asynchronous scope. And the messages within the asynchronous scope is executed at last because it is not dependent on any of these message processors or it is not dependent to provide a result or response to the service. So it has executed at the end. And if you see here, we have new suppliers, supplier 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can even search with the supplier names also. So this way we are mentioning them. You can create new purchase orders or new invoices for these suppliers also. So this is our welcome message and we are sending a welcome note to all the employees and the stakeholders whoever can refer that. So this way we can configure the asynchronous scope. For example, I'm just going to use this out of the asynchronous scope and observe the result on the response of the service. So understanding this asynchronous scope is very important because it will be very useful to log the messages or loggers, and sometimes there might be a need like we can configure all the loggers in the asynchronous scope because it is not dependent on any of the result. Now I'm going to send a request. So whenever we have removed or moved the asynchronous scope out of the flow and we have added the components within the flow as a normal message process, then we can see that all the message process are executing one after the other, and also the message response is dependent and it is producing the result. And we will check the logs. So the logger in asynchronous scope is executing exactly and immediately after the subflow has completed. And this debug logger is not printing because we have not configured the debug logger in Log4j. This way we can configure asynchronous scope. Now let us move this to async mode. So let us discuss one more scenario. We have a new supplier information and this needs to be created. This is instead of getting it as a list of suppliers, we want to create this supplier service. And whenever the supplier is created successfully on the target system, once we get that success response from that system, we want to send that information or notification to stakeholders, and we don't want to wait for the response for that message processor, so that you can implement the same in asynchronous scope. I'm going to use a simple service flow. Here use HTTP listener supplier. This should be a post method, and in post response, I want to add a transform message. JSON. Supplier created successfully. And after that, I want to send that information. So I'm going to add a logger, and you can add whatever the information that you want to add. Send supplier details to stakeholders. Here I want all the information like payload, use values of. So these values of information will be useful to fetch all the values of the payload. I want to know whether the supplier details to stakeholders is sent or not. If there is any error, then the last logger within this asynchronous scope will be not printed. So we need to add proper logging. Here we are mentioning post suppliers flow. So I have added a logger, started and completed, and one transform message to indicate that the supplier is created successfully. And once I get the success response, that means it will move further in the flow. If there is any error, then this component will be failed and error will be returned. That's why I have added this component. And in between this, in generally what will happen, there will be another service you can call it as system API, or there might be a database call. So you are going to send this information to the database, like this record has to be created, and from database you will get success or failure response. Based on that, you are going to add the response. Now I am going to use a set variable, and this set variable I am going to use input request payload, because by using this transform message we are overriding the payload. So to use the supplier details, I am declaring a variable and I am going to use that variable here, vars dot input request. Deploy the changes. I'm going to use this service. Click on history. If you want to use the same service, so you can create a new one. And here we are going to use body JSON format. Supplier file, hospitality services. Send a request. Sorry, this should be post and the resource is suppliers. Whenever we send this information, we are getting a response from the service, and there is a message supplier is created, and we can check what is the information that is being sent to the service within the asynchronous scope. So these two loggers are printed in sequence without depending on the response of the asynchronous scope message processors. And here we are send supply details to stakeholders and supply details sent to stakeholders, and we can see that information, what is the information that has been sent. So whenever we use values of that particular request, we can see that all the information within that payload is captured as an array of records. So this information, it will be removed with keys. It will capture only the values of that particular keys, and that way we can enhance the service joined by hyphen, so that a particular string message will be sent. It is dependent on the requirement how we want to send the data or the message to the target. Redeploy the changes and observe the request. Now, if we see, the information that we are sending is supplier 5 and the human brains hospitality services and the status and also all the information where it is located and which state. So this way we can achieve the asynchronous scope with a different scenario. So next scope within Mulesoft is Foreach, and Foreach iterates through a list of elements or a collection or array, and the list will be processed sequentially. The message process defined within the Foreach scope will be executed for each element or for each message. So by default, if we do not provide any expression, it is going to iterate or split that messages or payload by using the payload expression. And we can configure this to change if the iteration list is different from the payload. And the payload will not be altered. That means whatever the payload was there before the for each scope, it will not be changed even after the completion of for each scope. So it will remain same. And we need to define the variables within the for each if we want to capture that particular information or the result of the for each scope. We need to create variables to capture result of the for each scope. And we can access the root payload using the root message, and there will be counter variable. So within the counter variable, you can access that variable within the for each scope. So like the number of records are 5, and for each message, the counter will be increased. And we can even set the batch size that we'll discuss when to use the batch size and how we can set it. So let us have a scenario and we can implement the for each. For example, we have a numbers 1 to 10 or what are the numbers. So we want to calculate the sum of the numbers. So you can do this by using for each. I'm going to Anypoint Studio and I'm creating a new configuration file, scopes implementation. So within scopes implementation, add a flow, stopping the application. And here add a HTTP listener. Name it as for each sum because I want to calculate the sum. So I'm going to use transform message, and within transform message, I'm producing a JSON and I want to define 1 to 10 numbers. So this will provide an array of 1 to 10 numbers. And now I'm going to use for each. Before for each, let us deploy the changes and observe the result. So this is for understanding purpose. And once we understand this, then we can implement another scenario and use case. Application is deployed, tested from Postman. It is having an array of records 1 to 10. So we want to process this each message or each record. As of now, it is having only a single value. But in general scenario, it might be having an object or it might be having another list of arrays within arrays. So you need to process each of the message. For that purpose, you need to split this payload into messages. So to split the messages, we need to use for each component. So for each component, it will split that payload into each message. So whenever we have this 1 to 10 message numbers, so it is going to execute the for each scope 10 times. And if we do not mention the collection, it is going to split the collection based on the payload. And if you see here, there is a counter. Counter variable is counter. You can name it. If you want to know the record that is being processed, you can access that by using the counter variable. And by default, the batch size is 1, so that all the message, so each record within this array will be divided or splitted into a different message. And there is a root message. If we want to access the main payload, then you can access using root message variable. Now within the for each scope, I'm going to add a logger. So within this logger, I'm going to add a payload. So what is the payload I want to understand? Add a logger and print the payload. And after that payload, I want to increment the number by 5, and then I want to add the result for the next component. Add a transform message. And here I'm mentioning incrementer is 5. It is a variable. So I want to add this payload and with 5. So it is going to provide a result. I want this as number. And after that, add one more logger. After increment, add one more transform message at the end of the flow outside of for each component. So here also I'm going to add a payload. Saving the changes. Application is deployed. Just send a request to the service. So whenever we send the request to the service, the first component has executed, and after that, it is executing the for each scope. So within for each, we can see that payload 1 and then payload after increment is 6, and there is payload 2. So that means within this payload, each of these will be splitted into a different payload and be processed as a different message. Here we can observe that the for each scope have been executed 10 times for the first logger, payload logger, and increment logger. That means we can observe that result, it has increased. It is added. If we observe the response, we are still getting the response which is happening before the for each component. So to get a new result or new response, we need to hold this variable. We need to hold this result into a variable, and we need to refer that in the final comps of the next message processor after the for each scope. So basically what is happening, whatever the payload that was available before the for each component, it is still available after the for each component. So the payload remains intact. So after this transform message, define one more transform message, and within this, create a variable. Create a variable as result. And this result should be an array. That means we need to use this variable result because the first time this result variable will have an empty value, we need to define a default empty array. And then after that, add the result where, sorry, it is in the payload. But this payload we want to add into the array. So I'm going to embed this into the array and combining these two results. Now we have a result of for each scope in the result variable. Instead of payload in the last component, add a message pairs.result. Now deploy the changes and test it. Test the flow. And if we see here, now we are getting a new array of records that is incremented by 5. And our aim is to get sum of the 1 to 10 numbers. So to get sum of these numbers, we need to define one more variable here. So to get sum of the records, we can create a new variable, create a variable, sum response. Here we want sum of this payload. That means the first record and then sum of response. So by default, this sum response will be not available. So add a value 0. So we are going to add the first record, that is 1, to variable response 0. So first time it will become 1, and then whenever the next record is processed, so the next time 2 will be the payload and 2 is going to be added to the 1. So that means it will become 3. Likewise, we can have the response. Here, new array some response. Where's that some response? Changes are deployed. Let us test this. Yeah, if we see here, there is a new array and some response is 55. If we calculate the sum of 1 to 10 numbers, you can get this result. So likewise, we can perform the operations within the for each so that it is going to perform the operation on the for each of the message within that particular payload or array, or it can be an object as well. But it is going to process it for each of the component. But it is going to process each message through all the message process that are configured within the for each, and it will be processed sequentially. That means once the first message is processed, then only it will process for the second one. So whenever there is a dependency on the previous message within that array or list of elements, then we can configure the for each scope. And if there is any failure within this message process, then the next message and the next messages will not be executed. So let us enhance the requirement. So whenever the input array or the record is greater than 5, then we want to multiply this with an input value that we are going to send from the query parameters, and then it wants to be added to 5. So I'm going to add the logic if payload is less than 6, or you can mention less than or equal to 5, then this statement else payload into 2 and then increment the number plus 5 as number. So instead of 2, I want to give this value from a query parameters. So that query parameter variable we will define as var dot multiplier. I am going to create a variable. So within the transform message, we can create variables using plus icon and then variable here multiplier. And this value, I wanted to access it from the query parameters attributes dot query params dot multiply. So this variable I am going to use within the for each scope. Whenever the value is less than or equal to 5, I want to directly increment with 5. Otherwise, if it is greater than 5, then I want to multiply and then increment the value. Save the changes. Now send a request. Whenever we are trying to send a request, now if we see that it is failing with some expression, number 6 as number, so but it expects the arguments of number and number. It was trying to multiply the number with a value which is not available. So we are not sending the multiplier value in query parameters. Let us try to send the value multiplier equal to 2. Use at 12 and then 5 is added. So 17. Likewise, we are getting the new numbers in new array. So I'm going to add the old values also. Make a change. Old values, new values. So the payload was not impacted. I'm going to use refer as payload. Old values, sum. I'm just naming the keys. And if we observe that whenever we have not sent the multiplier, it was unable to execute the records. We are going to save the changes and observe when it was failed and what is the reason it was failing. Application deployed. I'm sending a request. So if you see, we are getting the values 1 to 10, and we have said we are building a logic wherever the value is greater than 5. That means for the sixth record, so the value is 6. So it needs to be multiplied with 2 and then added with 5. So the result will be 17. Likewise, we have all the new values and then the old value sum is 55. It is not changed. But if we are not sending this value, then we have some issue. I'm clearing the logs and then send a request. If we observe the logs, it was able to successfully execute the first 5 messages within the 1 to 10 records of array. But whenever it has reached the sixth record, the value is greater than 5 and it was unable to multiply that value with a value which is not available, which is a null value, and it is failing the records. So whenever this kind of failures will happen in any of the component within the Foreach scope, the entire components or the entire messages will be treated as a failure and it will throw an exception. It is to understand the expression, how it happens and will it process the next messages or not. So it is going to stop the execution of the flow. To understand this in a different way, if there is a scenario like even though there is a failure for one of the messages, we still wanted to proceed, then you can use the try scope block. For example, I am going to define try the added try component, and then within the try component, we can add the message process so that whenever there is an exception, we can make sure that it is not impacting the other messages. So we can add error continue if we want to proceed further with the next message process, or if we want to propagate that error, you can still use the on error propagate. I am going to use a transform message again. And within the transform message, so here we have the payload, and I'm going to use the same expression. Instead of the multiplier as 0, I'm going to use a different value. Default, it should be multiplied with 3. We can still use that here, but we want to throw an error from here and use and handle it within the try scope on error continue. We are creating this scenario. So this is a sum response. So we can still create that variable before the try scope because it is not dependent on this. Sum response. Save the changes. Yeah, to make sure that we understand this try scope, I'm adding a logger. Try scope success. Error. Yeah, application is deployed. Let us test the scenario again. And now we can see that the values and the response is able to produce because we have added the scenario to handle the exception. Whenever there is no multiplier value, we are throwing that into the error handling on error continue. So here, if we see that we have a default value. Let us understand this in debug mode. Deploy the application debug. Application deployed successfully. I'm adding a breakpoints here. Send a request. So this option is whether we want to run the entire debug mode in the debug mode or design mode. So if you want the debug mode, you can still choose. So here, if you see this, there is a payload none. I'm going to move to the next message processor. And if we can observe this, there are 1 to 10 numbers as an array. And these numbers, we still wanted to process one by one. And we are mentioning the batch size as 1. So each time, one message will be treated as one payload. So payload is 1. And I'm going to move. So for every message, each message processor will be executed within the for each component in a sequential manner. So one after the other. And for example, if there are 10 messages, all the 10 messages will be executed. Once the first message is executed successfully, then only the second message will be executed. Likewise, all the messages also will execute in a sequential manner. All the messages all the message processors will be executed in a sequential manner, and also within for each, all the messages also will be executed in sequential manner. So now the payload is 5. Now the payload is 6. That means it is greater than 5. I'm going to move further. Observe the try scope. So within try scope, we are seeing this error. There is a null value and unable to multiply. Move further. And it is throwing that error into this try component on error continue error handler. And let us see the error message. Try scope error null. Error message. We will see this, why the message is not printing. Add a error dot description so that it will add the error. And I'm moving further. So because we have added on error continue, even though there is an error within this try scope message processor, it is still able to produce the result and continue further. So this way we can even use the try scope. So try is also one of the component and it is one of the Mulesoft scope. So this way we can proceed further and we can continue the message process. Whenever there is an error, it will go to the on error continue and then it will perform the operation. So accordingly, based on the requirement, we need to build this logic. This is about try scope. We will discuss this batch size, how it will be executed, and also we still need to discuss about the, instead of array, we can even process the list of elements, means we can process the object also by using Foreach scope, that we will discuss. So basically, this try scope will enables you to handle the errors and that may occur when attempting to execute the components inside the try scope. So because whenever we want to handle the exceptions at message processor level, then we can use the try scope. This try scope also support the transaction. For example, if there are more operations that you want to get the information and insert the information, then you can use the transactional scope. So basically, it will handle the errors and then it can be either continued or propagated by using the on error propagate or on error continue exception handlers. Let us see the options for transactional. So if you see here, there is a transactional type indifferent and also transaction type local. So you can configure these transactions. Now we have seen the try scope. For example, suppose this, instead of transfer message, assume that there is a database activity. You want to update that information. So whenever you want to update that information to the database, sometimes there might be a database connectivity failure. So whenever the connectivity failure happens, you might need to retry the particular connection failure. So we can make use of until successful scope and then configure the required thing. So basically what it will do, the message process added within the until successful scope will be executed until all the message processes are executed successfully. For example, if there are multiple message processors within the scope, so I'm going to define until successful. And within until successful, I'm going to configure the message processor. And here we need to provide few properties like maximum retries that it can retry and maximum milliseconds between the retries. That means if there is an connectivity failure, there is any exception, but we want to retry that particular message processors for each second. That means 1000 milliseconds means 1 second. For each 1 second, I want to retry this whenever there is a failure, but for 2 times. That means It is going to execute the actual thread one time and it will retry for 2 more times if there is any exception within that particular operation of the message process. If we have configured 10 message process within this until successful, if any exception happens within that 10 message process, then it is going to retry. I'm going to save the changes. Let us just observe the difference. I'm going to add one more condition here. To understand the difference, I'm adding one more condition. Whenever VAT's counter is 8, means only for the 8th message in this group of messages, I want to apply this condition. Otherwise, I don't want to retry. Make the redeploy the changes. Send a request. I'm going to wait until there is an error. Yeah, if you observe, there is an error because the record is 6th record and the value is 6. So let's proceed further. Since it is configured within the try scope and the value is not equal to 8, it is moved to the default router because we have configured choice router. And from the choice router, it is going to throw an exception because there is an expression failure within the transform message. And that exception has thrown to the try scope block on error continue. And it moved to further because we are continuing the process. Let us move further. It is the 7th record and the value is 7. It's fine. Now observe this. Now we are in the 8th record. Counter is 8. To check that counter value, you can verify the counter variables. So since it is a choice condition is going to match vars.counter, if there is any exception in that particular processor, then it is going to throw to the until successful first. And then it is going to retry. If we observe here, it has tried once and failed, and second time also it is failed. And it is still able to retry further because we have configured the scope properties as 2 times to be retried, and for each 1 second it needs to retry. Now it has completed 3 attempts, then it is going to throw an exception. If it is still going to fail in all the attempts, I mean, if we have configured 3 attempts and it is still failing, it is finally going to throw an exception. And we observe that it is continued further because this until successful scope is configured within the try scope and we are handling that error. In case if there is a try component outside, in case if this until successful scope is configured outside of the try scope, and if it is still failing, then it is going to throw an exception and the process will be stopped. I'm going to continue further and then we will observe the next scenario. If we observe here, we are still getting the result. And for 8th record, we can see that it is producing a 29 as a result. So 29 means 8 3s are 24 plus 5, 29. Now I'm moving this until successful out of this try scope. So in default, it is not required. So whenever there is a counter 8, then I want to retry the message processor. This process or this operation I want to retry for 2 more attempts. Then I want to execute the process. If it is still failing, then I want to stop the process. Let us execute until we get the 8th record. Yeah, we have on the 8th record. Yeah, we are on the 8th record. Let us move further step by step. Now we are in the choice router. Counter is matching with the expression, and it is going to execute the message processor within the until successful scope. It has failed and it is going to retry after 1 second. If it is still failing, then it will try one more time after 1 second. If it is executed all the attempts and it is still failing, then it is going to throw an exception. And this exception will be mule retry exhausted because it was tried and all the attempts are failed. It is going to throw a mule retry exhausted exception. Copy this exception and mark it. If all the attempts are failed, then it will throw below exception. This is how we can use the until successful scope. So now we have discussed asynchronous scope, for each scope, try scope, and until successful scope. Now observe the for each scope with the different batch size. I'm going to execute everything and then we can see that it is throwing an exception because the process itself was failed. In previous case, this until successful choice condition was within the try scope and the try scope was able to handle the error and continue further. But now we have moved this until successful scope outside of the try scope. So which we are not handling the exception if there is any exception. We are just retrying this for two more times. This way we can configure the different scopes. Now observe the batch size configuration for each. Now here instead of 1, I'm going to configure 3. So for each 3 messages or 3 elements within the collection, it is going to convert that into a sub array of elements. For example, I'm going to move this into the try scope so that we will know the value. And now we have configured the batch size as 3. Whenever we configure the batch size as 3, it is going to create a sub arrays. So the application is deployed. Send a request. Let us check. So it is producing an 1 to 10 numbers array of records. And whenever we enter into this for each scope, Let us see what is the result. Now we can see that it is having a size 3. That means it is also an array. Go to expression and here payload. Just to check what is the values that we are getting. So within Foreach also, after we have used the batch size configuration as 3, it is dividing each 3 messages into an array of records. So likewise, it is going to split the main collection into sub collections, and then we need to process it accordingly. So now we need to define one more for each to process these messages. So this is the batch size, and it will be used whenever we want to process batches, or for example, we have received so many records from the source system, and out of those source system, uh, and out of those records, we wanted to split that array or collection into sub collection and then process the records. Then we can configure the batch size. So this is batch size use. And now we will understand one more example. So within the payload collection, we can mention different values as well. So here I'm going to add values. We have values, and then I'm mentioning number values. String values. I'm just going to define apple, orange. So we have two sets of records. One is number values and string values. So it will contain 1 to 10 numbers, and it is having the fruit names. So this is an object. So we can even perform our conditions on the object as well for each iteration. Complete this process and then save the changes. After changes are done, send one more request. Now we have a batch size of 1, and this is our input request to the for each scope. Now we have not defined any collection. So it is going to apply that split on the payload itself. So let us see what will be the payload. So here we have a payload number values. That means it is going to consider only the first record, and then it will process the record. Since it is going to contain this again number values, we need to define our, or we have to restructure our process. Whenever we receive these number values as key, then we need to define a separate process. And whenever we receive the string values, then again we have to process a different thing. For example, within this, you can have one more choice condition. Within this choice condition, you can check if the key is number values, then you are going to perform this operation. And then if the key is string values, then you need to add the values like for apple, you sometimes maybe you want to get that code of the apple. So you are going to get that information. Likewise, you can define the process. So to make sure that we are reading the correct collection, or if you want to process this collection as well, then we need to define this process or restructure the process. Like we have to read these values first, payload.number values, and then process through these collections. Likewise, we need to restructure. So in our case, we want to iterate over these values. We have to mention this collection in the configuration. I'm going to move further and see. If you see here, it was unable to process because the values are not in the expected format and it is giving an object record. So I'm going to send one more request. And instead of collection by default, we need to mention that we want the values from payload.number values. So we want to iterate over the number values records and then process the collection. So save the changes and then observe the result. In this scenario, we will need to get the correct result, even though there are exceptions, like if we are sending the multiplier or not, or let me check this. This try scope should be outside and choice should be for the until successful. So now we have configured the payload collection as payload.number values, and then we have a try scope. Within try scope, we have until successful scope. Even though there are failures after the number of attempts, we are still going to continue the process. Send the request and observe it. So we have number values and string values. Now we are going to fetch only the number values collection. And we can see that it is going to split that number values collection into each individual messages, and then it will process them. If there is an exception, it will be handled on error continue, and then it will produce the result. Until successful will be retried for 2 more times. That means total 3 times. So this way we can see that this is the old values, number values and string values, and we have new values and the sum. This is how we can configure for each with batch size. So till now we have discussed flows, subflows, and private flows. These will be run in synchronous mode. That means each message processor will wait for the previous message processor to be completed successfully. And asynchronous scope will be executed on a separate thread and independently. So if any message processor is there, it is not going to wait for the asynchronous scope result. And for each scope will define over a collection of elements, and it will split that collection into each individual messages, and then we need to process for each of the record. If there are multiple message processors, if there are multiple message processors configured in for each scope, for each message, all the message processors will be executed in sequential manner. And after the successful completion of first message, then only the second individual message will be processed. That means it will process the messages also in sequential manner. And the batch size will be configured if there are more messages and we want to process the records in batch size. So it is going to split the collection into individual sub arrays. It will split the collection into sub collections. So we need to use for each again. It depends on the requirements. And then to capture the result of the for each scope, we have to define a variable and we have to refer them after the for each scope completion. And in our batch size configuration, for example, if there are 100 messages or 100 records within that collection, and if we have configured batch size as 10, so for each 10 messages, the batch will split the messages into 10 groups and 10 messages. And if there are 99 messages and the batch size is 10, then it is going to split the records into, then it is going to split the records or messages into group of tens, and within each group we will have 10 messages, and in the last group we will have 9 messages, because it is going to process all the 90 messages in the 9 batches, and in one batch we need to process the remaining records. Likewise, we can configure the batch size, and we also configured and observed the try scope, how it will work and behave, and we have discussed until successful scope also. And in our next session we will discuss about parallel for each and cache scope. And you can try this for each scope on this scenario. So the scenario is like that. We have a supplier records. Okay. On supplier, we have different sites information. So this is the sites information. So for each site, we want to check the debit limit for each supplier site based on the postal code. So if the postal code starts with 5, then we can define a limit of 100,000. And if it is different postal code, then we need to define a limit of 80,000. Likewise, we need to define a configuration and define the debit limit. So based on the debit limit, we need to assign the new value into the records. You can try for today, and tomorrow we will start with this use case, and then we will continue further. So I'm going to redefine the use case. We have supplier information with multiple sites, and we need to check for each site debit limit. So debit limit is based on postal code. If postal code starts with 5, set limit to 100,000. Else set to 80,000. And this information we need to overwrite in our input record. input record or payload. Final response from the service should be like so. This is our final response. So we have a input record without debit limit. This is our input record with supplier information and sites information, and we don't have a debit limit. So we want to add this debit limit based on the postal code and set this information for each supplier site and get that as an output. Thank you. Please like, share, and subscribe.